Blood soaked into Pennsylvania soil, staining America's heartland a deep crimson as the nation tore itself apart. The early summer of 1863 marked not just another battle in the American Civil War, but a turning point that would forever alter the course of history and inspire words that would echo through generations. General Robert E. Lee, emboldened by the Confederate victory at Chancellorsville just 2 months prior, chose to take the fight directly into Union territory. His Army of Northern Virginia, 75,000 strong, marched northward, crossing through Maryland into Pennsylvania. The audacious move threatened northern cities and promised to sever vital supply routes. More importantly, Lee believed, a significant victory on northern soil might force President Abraham Lincoln to negotiate peace terms favorable to the Confederate cause. Meanwhile, in Washington, President Lincoln paced the floors of the White House, his tall, lanky frame casting long shadows in the lamplight. Despite being in the third year of a brutal civil war, Lincoln remained steadfast in his commitment to preserve the Union. His face, already deeply lined with the burdens of leadership, grew more haggard with each passing day. The president barely slept during those critical days of late June, wrote Presidential Secretary John Hay in his journal. He would often remain at the War Department telegraph office until dawn, waiting for news from the front. Major General Joseph Hooker, commanding the Union's Army of the Potomac, trailed Lee's forces but struggled to divine the Confederate commander's true intentions. Lincoln, frustrated by Hooker's hesitancy, made a momentous decision just days before the battle would commence, replacing Hooker with Major General George Gordon Meade. The president's choice was not without risk, noted historian James McPherson, in his Pulitzer Prize-winning work, Battle Cry of Freedom. Meade had never commanded an entire army before, and now found himself leading the Union's principal fighting force at a moment of supreme crisis. Meade took command on June 28th. Only 3 days before the battle would begin, the new commander quickly set about reorganizing his forces and establishing a defensive posture designed to protect Washington and Baltimore while pursuing Lee's army. The people of Gettysburg, a small crossroads town of just 2,000 souls, went about their daily lives with growing unease as rumors of approaching armies swirled. Seminary student William Howell recalled the eerie calm. "We could feel a palpable tension in the air, like the stillness before a violent thunderstorm. Few could have imagined the tempest about to break upon our quiet town." On June 30th, Confederate soldiers from General A.P. Hill's corps ventured toward Gettysburg, seeking badly needed supplies, particularly shoes for their infantry. What they found instead were elements of Union cavalry under the command of Brigadier General John Buford. The stage was now set. The morning of July 1st dawned clear and warm as Buford's cavalry took defensive positions on McPherson's Ridge northwest of town. Around 8 o'clock, Confederate infantry under Major General Henry Heth approached from the west along the Chambersburg Pike. Buford's men, though outnumbered, deployed dismounted along the ridge, their breech-loading carbines allowing them to deliver a higher rate of fire than their opponents' muzzle loaders. Major General John Reynolds, commanding the Union First Corps, rode ahead of his men to assess the situation. Upon arriving at Buford's position, he famously declared, "The devil's to pay, John," before dispatching urgent messages ordering his infantry forward at double-quick time. What began as a chance encounter between opposing forces was about to escalate into one of the most consequential battles in American history. Neither Lee nor Meade had planned to fight at Gettysburg, yet their armies were now converging on the small Pennsylvania town that would soon become hallowed ground. The first shots rang out, echoing across the fields and woodlots west of town. The Battle of Gettysburg had begun. Reynolds' First Corps arrived just as Buford's cavalry was being pressed back from their defensive positions. The Union infantry rushed forward, relieving the beleaguered cavalrymen and establishing a new line along McPherson's Ridge. The battle quickly intensified as more Confederate brigades joined the fight. During this crucial early phase of the battle, tragedy struck the Union command. General John Reynolds, while directing his men near the edge of Herbst Woods, was struck by a Confederate bullet and killed instantly. His death, coming mere hours into the battle, sent shockwaves through the Union ranks. The loss of Reynolds was incalculable. wrote Colonel Charles Wainwright in his diary that evening. He was among our finest commanders, and his men would have followed him anywhere. Despite this devastating blow, the Union forces held their ground through the morning hours. By early afternoon, however, Confederate reinforcements from Richard Ewell's corps arrived from the north, threatening the Union right flank. Simultaneously, additional divisions from A.P. Hill's corps increased pressure from the west. The Union position gradually became untenable. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the Union line collapsed. Union soldiers retreated through the streets of Gettysburg in disarray, leaving behind numerous prisoners. Many regrouped on Cemetery Hill south of town, a defensible position that would prove crucial in the days ahead. As referenced in the official report of the Army of the Potomac, the 1st and 11th Corps, though greatly outnumbered, fought with remarkable obstinacy and gallantry, yielding only when overcome by superior numbers, and then falling back in comparative good order to the Cemetery Ridge position. Major General Winfield Scott Hancock arrived late in the afternoon, sent ahead by General Meade to take command of the field. Hancock's presence stabilized the situation. His tactical acumen was immediately evident as he strengthened the Union position along Cemetery Hill and directed arriving units to extend the line southward along Cemetery Ridge. Lee arrived on the battlefield that evening. From Seminary Ridge, he observed the Union forces establishing what appeared to be a strong defensive position. Lieutenant General James Longstreet, commanding Lee's 1st Corps, urged his commander to maneuver around the Union left, forcing Meade to attack the Confederate Army on ground of their choosing. "The enemy is there," Lee reportedly said, pointing toward Cemetery Hill, "and I am going to attack him there." The second day dawned with both armies fully deployed. The Union line resembled a fishhook, running from Culp's Hill on the right, along Cemetery Hill, and down Cemetery Ridge before curving eastward to Little Round Top. The Confederate forces occupied Seminary Ridge to the west and positions north and northeast of town. Lee ordered an attack against both Union flanks, with Longstreet's corps striking the southern end of the Union line, while Ewell's corps assaulted Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill. The main Confederate assault began around 4 in the afternoon, as Longstreet's divisions advanced across the open fields toward the Union position. What followed was some of the war's most intense fighting. At Little Round Top, Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and the 20th Maine Regiment executed a desperate bayonet charge when their ammunition ran out, securing this vital position. Nearby, in the infamous Peach Orchard and Wheat Field, terrible carnage ensued as possession of these areas changed hands multiple times. The fighting continued until darkness fell. Though the Confederates made significant gains, including temporarily breaching the Union defenses at Cemetery Hill, they failed to dislodge the Union Army from its positions. That night, Lincoln received a telegraph from General Halleck describing the first 2 days of fighting. "The battle began early yesterday and was continued without intermission until dark and with great severity. Our troops behaved splendidly. The enemy attacked and was repulsed at all points. As the sun set on July 2nd, both armies counted their losses and prepared for what would become the battle's decisive day." July 3rd, 1863, dawned hot and humid over Gettysburg. The morning silence was shattered at dawn when Union forces launched an attack to reclaim positions on Culp's Hill lost the previous evening. For nearly 7 hours, brutal fighting raged on the Union right flank before the Confederates were finally pushed back. Meanwhile, General Robert E. Lee finalized plans for what he hoped would be the battle's decisive action. Despite Longstreet's continued objections, Lee ordered a massive frontal assault against the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. The attack would be preceded by an artillery bombardment designed to soften Union defenses and silence their guns. Major General George Pickett's fresh division from Longstreet's corps would form the attack's southern wing, joined by divisions from A.P. Hill's corps to the north. In total, approximately 15,000 Confederate soldiers would participate in the assault that would forever bear Pickett's name. "I have surveyed the ground and made all arrangements for the attack," Lee informed his generals that morning. "The artillery is to refine the enemy's batteries, after which Longstreet will attack." General Longstreet, still convinced of the folly of a frontal assault, reportedly replied, "General, I have been a soldier all my life. I have been with soldiers engaged in fights by couples, by squads, companies, regiments, divisions, and armies, and should know as well as anyone what soldiers can do. It is my opinion that no 15,000 men ever arrayed for battle can take that position. According to accounts in the Richmond Examiner, Lee remained undeterred, believing that one more concentrated effort would break the Union center and secure a Confederate victory on Northern soil. At approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the Confederate artillery opened fire. Nearly 150 guns unleashed what survivors described as the most terrible bombardment of the war. The Union position on Cemetery Ridge disappeared in clouds of smoke and dust as shells exploded among the Federal troops. Union artillery. Chief Brigadier General Henry Hunt initially ordered his guns to return fire, but after about 30 minutes directed many batteries to cease firing, both to conserve ammunition and to create the impression that Confederate fire had disabled the Union guns. This strategic deception would have deadly consequences for the attacking Confederates. After nearly 2 hours of bombardment, the Confederate guns fell silent. Across the field, Federal soldiers peered over their stone walls and breastworks, watching as neat lines of gray-clad infantry emerged from the woods along Seminary Ridge. It was a magnificent sight, wrote Union Colonel Frank Haskell in his account of the battle. As they moved steadily across the field, their ranks perfectly aligned as if on parade, their bayonets glistening in the afternoon sun. The distance between Seminary Ridge and the Union position on Cemetery Ridge was approximately 3/4 of a mile, a stretch of open ground offering virtually no cover for the advancing Confederates. As the gray lines approached, Union artillery, largely intact despite the bombardment, opened fire with devastating effect. Solid shot tore through the Confederate ranks, followed by exploding shells and finally canister, turning artillery pieces into giant shotguns that swept entire sections of the Confederate line away. Despite horrific casualties, the Confederates pressed forward. As they came within range, Union infantry rose from behind their stone walls and delivered volley after volley into the approaching enemy. The attack began to lose cohesion as more and more men fell, and the advancing line fragmented around obstacles in their path. A small contingent of Confederates, led by Brigadier General Lewis Armistead of Pickett's division, managed to breach the Union line at a point that would become known as the high water mark of the Confederacy. Armistead, his hat raised on his sword as a guide, led his men over the stone wall before falling mortally wounded. The breakthrough proved momentary. Union reserves rushed to seal the gap, and the surviving Confederates, now without support and surrounded on 3 sides, were forced to surrender or retreat across the killing field they had just traversed. "The great attack has failed," Longstreet reportedly said as Lee rode among the survivors, attempting to rally them for a possible Union counterattack. "General," Lee replied, "this has been a sad day for us. Too sad to talk about." According to General John B. Gordon's later memoir, Lee accepted full responsibility, telling his men, "It is all my fault. I thought my men were invincible." Late afternoon, it was clear the gamble had failed catastrophically. Of the roughly 15,000 men who participated in Pickett's charge, more than half became casualties. The Army of Northern Virginia had suffered a defeat from which it would never fully recover. As night fell on July 3rd, an eerie quiet settled over the battlefield, broken only by the moans of wounded men lying between the lines. A steady rain began to fall, washing blood into Pennsylvania soil. Both armies were exhausted, having fought for 3 consecutive days in summer heat. The casualty figures were staggering. The Union Army suffered approximately 23,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing. Confederate losses were even higher, with estimates ranging from 23,000 to 28,000 men. In the small town of Gettysburg, with a population of just 2,000, nearly 8,000 dead soldiers lay awaiting burial. The aftermath presented a scene of horror almost inconceivable in our day and time, wrote New York Times correspondent Samuel Wilkson, who had come to Gettysburg searching for his son among the wounded, only to find him dead on the field. The ground is strewn with fragments of shell, broken artillery carriages, discarded rifles, and the countless debris of battle. But more terrible than all are the torn and mangled bodies of those who but yesterday were in the full flush of life and strength. July 4th, Independence Day, brought no celebrations. Instead, Lee ordered his battered army to begin its retreat to Virginia. Wagon trains of wounded stretched for 17 miles, making slow progress on rain-soaked roads. The Confederates reached the Potomac River only to find it swollen by recent rains, temporarily trapping the Army of Northern Virginia on the northern bank. General Meade, also dealing with enormous casualties and exhausted troops, pursued cautiously. President Lincoln, receiving reports in Washington, grew increasingly frustrated with Meade's deliberate pace. In a telegram that he ultimately decided not to send, Lincoln wrote, he was ready to pounce upon Lee had he made a stand. But seeing that Lee was returning to Virginia, he determined to see him safely across without a fight. When Meade finally brought his army up to the Confederate position along the Potomac on July 12th, he found Lee's forces well entrenched. After a council of war, Meade decided against attacking the Confederate fortifications. By July 14th, the river had receded enough for Lee's army to cross back into Virginia, ending the Gettysburg campaign. According to historical records published in The War of the Rebellion, official records of the Union and Confederate armies, Lincoln's disappointment was profound. We had them within our grasp, he reportedly told his cabinet. We had only to stretch forth our hands, and they were ours. Despite this lost opportunity to potentially end the war in the summer of 1863, the strategic situation had been fundamentally altered. The twin Union victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, the latter falling to General Grant on July 4th, marked a decisive turning point in the conflict. The physical toll on Gettysburg itself was immense. Every public building became a hospital. Private homes took in wounded from both armies. Surgeons worked around the clock, performing amputations and operations with minimal anesthesia. The dead were initially buried in shallow graves near where they fell, with rudimentary markers when identification was possible. By mid-July, plans were underway for a more permanent cemetery for Union dead. David Wills, a prominent Gettysburg attorney, purchased 17 acres adjacent to the existing town cemetery on Cemetery Hill, ground that had been defended so tenaciously during the battle. Pennsylvania Governor Andrew Curtin appointed Wills as state agent to coordinate the creation of what would become Soldiers' National Cemetery. The work of disinterring Union soldiers from their battlefield graves and reburying them in the new cemetery began in October. Confederate dead remained in their field graves until later efforts, primarily by Southern organizations in the post-war years, relocated them to cemeteries in the South. As summer turned to autumn, President Lincoln received an invitation from David Wills to deliver a few appropriate remarks at the dedication ceremony for the new cemetery, scheduled for November 19th. The principal oration would be delivered by Edward Everett, considered America's greatest living orator, but Wills and the Cemetery Commission wanted the president's presence to lend national significance to the occasion. Lincoln accepted the invitation, recognizing an opportunity to reframe the purpose of the war in the public mind. As the nation struggled through its third year of bloody conflict, the president understood that a compelling articulation of what the Union was fighting for had become as crucial as military victories on the battlefield. In the crisp November days of 1863, as President Abraham Lincoln prepared for his journey to Gettysburg, the nation remained deeply divided. The Battle of Gettysburg had altered the military landscape, but the war's outcome remained uncertain, and public support for the conflict had waned with each casualty list. Lincoln's invitation to speak at the cemetery dedication provided an opportunity he recognized as significant. According to his secretary John Hay, the president had been contemplating a public statement on the war's meaning since issuing the Emancipation Proclamation nearly a year earlier. Now, standing on ground hallowed by sacrifice, he could address the nation with both the authority of his office and the solemnity befitting such consecrated soil. The president's journey to Gettysburg began on November 18th. He departed Washington by special train, accompanied by 3 members of his cabinet: Secretary of State William Seward, Postmaster General Montgomery Blair, and Interior Secretary John Usher, along with several foreign diplomats, military officials, and personal staff. The president appeared careworn, noted journalist Noah Brooks, who accompanied the presidential party. 4 months had passed since the Great Battle, yet one could see that the weight of the nation's struggles rested heavily upon him. The presidential train arrived in Gettysburg early in the evening. Lincoln was escorted to the home of David Wills on the town square, where he would spend the night. The house was crowded with distinguished guests, including Edward Everett, who had arrived earlier to tour the battlefield and prepare for his 2-hour oration. While popular tradition suggests Lincoln wrote his address on the train using the back of an envelope, historical evidence indicates otherwise. According to the Nicolay copy, one of 5 known drafts of the speech, Lincoln had begun crafting his remarks in Washington, writing most of the speech on Executive Mansion stationery. He likely revised the draft in Gettysburg the night before the ceremony. That evening, a crowd gathered outside the Wills house, calling for the president to speak. Lincoln briefly appeared at the door, stating, "I have no speech to make. In my position, it is somewhat important that I should not say foolish things." When a voice from the crowd replied, "If you can help it," Lincoln responded, "It very often happens that the only way to help it is to say nothing at all." With that gentle self-deprecation, he bid the crowd good night. The morning of November 19th dawned clear, but cold. As described in the Philadelphia Inquirer, the town was alive, with visitors who had come from all parts of the Union to witness the dedication ceremonies. Flags flew from public buildings and private residences, and a spirit of solemnity mixed with patriotic pride pervaded the atmosphere. Around 10 o'clock, a procession formed at the town square. Lincoln, mounted on a small chestnut bay horse, rode near the rear of the procession alongside Secretary Seward. Military units, civic organizations, and government officials preceded them. The procession wound its way through town and up Cemetery Hill to the newly established Soldiers' National Cemetery. An estimated 15,000 people had gathered for the ceremony. The crowd included wounded soldiers, grieving families, curious locals, and dignitaries from across the North. Conspicuously present were African Americans, for whom this war had taken on profound additional meaning since the Emancipation Proclamation. The formal program began with music, followed by a prayer offered by Reverend Thomas Stockton, chaplain of the U.S. Senate. Then Edward Everett rose to deliver the oration for which he had prepared meticulously. For 2 hours, Everett held the audience spellbound with his detailed account of the battle, historical parallels to ancient conflicts, and reflections on the war's significance. As Everett concluded to enthusiastic applause, few in the audience suspected that his lengthy address would soon be overshadowed by the brief remarks that would follow. After a musical interlude by the Baltimore Glee Club, the master of ceremonies introduced the President of the United States. Lincoln rose from his chair, adjusted his steel-rimmed spectacles, and stepped forward to address the assemblage. The crowd quieted as the tall, solemn figure in black prepared to speak. Many present would later recall the striking contrast between Lincoln's gaunt, careworn appearance and the profound words he was about to deliver. According to the New York Times correspondent present that day, there was a certain sadness in his countenance that seemed to speak of the nation's bereavement, yet also a quiet determination that suggested unshakable resolve. The president's high-pitched but carrying voice began, 7 years ago. 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. With these opening words, Lincoln immediately connected the present struggle to the founding ideals of the Republic. By reaching back 87 years to 1776 rather than 76 years to the Constitution of 1787, he deliberately emphasized the Declaration of Independence and its universal claims about human equality as the nation's true founding document. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, Lincoln continued, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. In just 10 sentences and 272 words, delivered in roughly 2 minutes, Lincoln redefined the meaning of the war and of American democracy itself. He transformed what had been primarily understood as a constitutional struggle to preserve the Union into a transcendent fight for human freedom and equality. The president's brevity struck many in the audience as inadequate to the occasion. The Chicago Times criticized, "The cheek of every American must tingle with shame as he reads the silly, flat, and dish-watery utterances of the man who has to be pointed out to intelligent foreigners as the President of the United States." Yet others recognized the power of Lincoln's concise eloquence immediately. The Providence Journal reported, "The dedicatory remarks by President Lincoln will live among the annals of man." Edward Everett himself wrote to Lincoln the following, "So, I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes." According to documentation in the Library of Congress archives, Lincoln responded modestly to Everett. "In our respective parts yesterday, you could not have been excused to make a short address, nor I a long one. I am pleased to know that, in your judgment, the little I did say was not entirely a failure." The significance of the Gettysburg Address grew over time, gradually becoming recognized as one of the most important speeches in American history. Lincoln had accomplished something remarkable. He had reinterpreted the American founding, redefined the Civil War's purpose, and set forth a vision for the nation's future in just 10 sentences. The address situated the horrific sacrifice at Gettysburg within a larger narrative of national purpose. The dead had not fallen merely to restore the Union as it had been, but rather had given the last full measure of devotion, so that a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, might endure. Lincoln's use of religious imagery throughout the speech, conceived, consecrate, hallow, devotion, new birth, elevated the national struggle to a spiritual plane. The war became not just a political or military contest, but a test of whether a democratic government could survive. Most radically, Lincoln subtly shifted the foundation of American governance from the Constitution to the Declaration of Independence. As historian Gary Wills noted in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Lincoln at Gettysburg, the president performed one of the most daring acts of open-air sleight of hand ever witnessed by the unsuspecting. In his brief time before the crowd, at Gettysburg, he wove a spell that has not yet been broken. The battlefield itself became a different kind of symbol after Lincoln's address. Journalist Lloyd Lewis later wrote, "Whatever clouds of glory had surrounded the tattered banners coming back from the field at Gettysburg in July were now, with the president's address in November, transformed into something approaching religious sanctification." In the months following his speech at Gettysburg, Lincoln continued to pursue both military victory and constitutional change. The 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery throughout the United States, was passed by the Senate in April 1864 and sent to the states for ratification after House approval in January 1865. Lincoln would not live to see final victory or the amendment's ratification. Just 5 days after General Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater. The nation that had been tested at Gettysburg now faced the challenge of Reconstruction without the leader who had so profoundly reframed its purpose. The battle's influence extended far beyond military history. The clash of armies at Gettysburg represented a collision between fundamentally different visions of America's future. Lincoln's address at the cemetery dedication transformed that bloody ground into a symbol of the nation's ongoing struggle to fulfill its founding promise. As historian Bruce Catton observed in This Hallowed Ground, what made the Battle of Gettysburg distinctive was not simply its scale or its casualties, but rather that it marked the moment when the federal government committed itself fully to a war aim that included not just restoration of the Union, but a new birth of freedom. Today, millions of visitors come to Gettysburg each year, walking the battlefield where so many fell and standing at the spot where Lincoln delivered his immortal address. The site serves as both a reminder of the terrible cost of civil conflict and an enduring testament to the resilience of democratic ideals. The final paragraph of Lincoln's brief remarks still resonates. "It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth." In those words, Delivered on hallowed ground made sacred by sacrifice, Lincoln articulated a vision of democracy that continues to inspire and challenge Americans nearly 2 centuries later. The battle at Gettysburg turned the tide of war, but Lincoln's address there transformed the nation's understanding of itself, a transformation that continues to shape America's ongoing struggle to live up to its founding ideals.